Welcome dear students. Today we have a unique kind of Sandhan lecture, or rather I would say a discussion. It's basically student-teacher interactions. This type of interactions was also carried out earlier year before, and it was very much welcomed by the students. So we have continued this practice, and today we have the students of final year BSc, third year BSc, who are here in the studio to ask certain questions or their difficulties regarding the practicals in microbiology. And to answer their queries, I have with me Shri Piyush Bhai Pandya from Gujarat College. He is well versed in microbiology with lots of experience. I would also be proud to say that he was my teacher too and have learnt a great from him. I am Rakesh Patel from RG Shah Science College, and both of us will try to satisfy the queries of the students. Since the time is short, that is of 1 hour, we'll be try to take as many questions from students as possible. And to start with, we will first begin with the student who will ask the questions, and in turn we will give the answers. Yes.
I am Ketya Neelam from RG Shah Science College, Ahmedabad. My question is, why tryptophan broth is used for isolation of bacteriophage?
Please have a seat. Neelam, your question is why tryptophan broth is used for phage isolation. Basically, one can use any kind of broth, that is a simple broth like nutrient broth also, but the tryptophan broth has some additional features in the sense that it contains tryptophan, and apart from that it also contains two main ingredients, that is the salts of calcium and magnesium. These salts of calcium and magnesium, they are very much essential for the attachment of the phage to the cell wall. That is, they help the phages for attachment over the cell wall, because you must have studied in lytic and lysogeny cycles, phage multiplication. The first step is adsorption, and adsorption requires certain metal ions, certain ions of calcium and magnesium, as a result of which the adsorption is better. Instead of using a normal broth which doesn't contain these kinds of salts, it is better to use tea broth, that is this broth which contains these salts. As a result, the attachment will be better and you will get a better results. Next question.
I'm Janel Kant from Gujarat Arts and Science College. I want to ask that what is the difference between Nelson and Cole's method?
Both basically are the methods for estimation of glucose, as all of you must be knowing. I believe most of you must also be having the answer at back of your mind, but let us make it more clear. Cole's method and Nelson's method are basically differentiated by their sensitivity. Whereas the Cole's method is considered a crude method, the method of Nelson and Somogyi is a fine method, that is the quantity of glucose in the unknown sample, if it is on the higher side, for example, you must be knowing that it is the range of Cole's method is about 1 to 4%, that is 1 to 4 gram of sugar in 100 ml of the sample, then this method gives us a very satisfactory result. But when the fine tuning has to be done, for example, you may calculate the amount of glucose by Cole's method in the range of a few grams in 100 ml, but when it comes to the milligram percentage or microgram per ml value, Cole's method will not give us a very satisfactory result. For this we have to resort to Nelson's method, which is a very sensitive method, which is basically, you must be knowing, it is a colorimetric method, and the color differentiation is measured by an extremely sensitive, ultra sensitive instrument, the colorimeter, or to be more specific, it can be measured by the spectrophotometer. So that is how Cole's method and Nelson's method are differentiated. We can go on talking a lot about the differences between these two, but I believe for the moment this much should be enough. Thank you.
Next, please.
But Mamta, SM Panchal Science College, Talud, what is the application of a gradient plate technique and why the two layers are made in gradient plate technique?
Piyush bhai, please.
A gradient plate technique is basically a technique which has been developed for finding out the resistant mutants against the given antibiotics. Now, I'll answer your second part of the question in the beginning, why two separate layers have to be made. Gradient, I hope everyone knows what is a gradient. Gradient is an increasing level of concentration, or you can also say it is a decreasing level of concentration. The difference depends upon from where do you begin, either from highest to lowest or the lowest to highest. Anyway, that is what is known as a gradient. Now, to prepare an antibiotic gradient, antibiotic you must be knowing is a water-soluble substance. Those antibiotics which can be used for human body application necessarily have to be water-soluble. So what happens is when we prepare a agar plate, nutrient agar plate, having a concentration gradient of the antibiotic, it becomes necessary to prepare two separate layers. You must have practiced this in your laboratory, that first of all you take half the amount of melted nutrient agar into the Petri plate, about 10 ml. You allow it to solidify in a tilted manner so that at one part of the Petri there is a huge amount of the agar material, and on the other hand the agar that is amount of the agar is to the bare minimal. Next you prepare an antibiotic containing agar solution, melted agar, to which antibiotic has already been added. So when this is overlaid over the already solidified tilted agar medium, what will happen is that the antibiotic will start diffusing. Now, because the earlier layer offers a continuous slope, the antibiotic containing layer of the medium will then allow the antibiotic to diffuse more in the downward direction rather than spreading in horizontal direction. The antibiotic will be encouraged to diffuse downwards, and that will readily prepare an extremely dependable or reliable concentration gradient of the antibiotic. So this is why two layers have to be distinctly prepared. This is to allow a proper development of the concentration gradient for the antibiotic. The basic objective of this experiment is almost self-explanatory. We try to isolate the mutants which are resistant to the antibiotic. Now, instead of picking up a random antibiotic resistant mutant, what happens here is that you pick up the mutant from the part of the Petri plate where the concentration of the antibiotic is found to be maximum. So you know that this necessarily will have tolerance beyond the MIC value for that particular organism towards that antibiotic. So this is why Cybelascript prepared a special technique for detection of antibiotic resistant mutant, which we know as gradient plate technique. Does it answer your question? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next question, please.
My name is Pankti Patel. I am from R.G. Shah Science College, and my question is, what is function of pigment in Serratia marcescens?
Okay, Pankti. Basically, Serratia marcescens produce a variety of pigments, variety of shades of pigments ranging from red to orange, or the shades of those. This pigment chemically it is a tripyrrole derivative and is known as a prodigiosin. Now, first I would like to say that pigment production in Serratia marcescens is a function of quorum sensing. That is, pigment will be produced only when the cell density reaches up to a certain level. If the number of the organisms is less, then the pigment production will not take place. However, when it reaches certain mark, more than certain number, then a pigment production will begin. This is basically called as a quorum sensing. Apart from this, pigment is a secondary metabolite, and Why they are produced in certain organisms is not definitively known, but in case of pigment production by Serratia marcescens, it has been found that these organisms are more sensitive to antibiotics, and secondly, pigment helps to protect the cells from UV radiations, that is radiation damage caused by sunlight or by some other means, is less in pigmented organisms as compared to non-pigmented organisms. Specifically, this is true when we take a case study of halobacteria, which are also pigmented organisms. It has been certainly confirmed in those organisms that those organisms which produces a pigment, they are less damaged. Pigment in turn provides a kind of a shield to the organisms. So this is probably one of the functions of pigment production. Next question, please.
Myself, Rachna Prajapati from Gujarat Arts and Science College. My question is, what is the role of peroxidase in blood glucose estimation by GOD-POD?
Okay, estimation of blood glucose is done by many methods, but as of now, one of the most popular method is by using two enzymes, glucose oxidase and peroxidase. The basic principle itself indicates what is the purpose of peroxidase, in a sense that the reaction takes place in a two-part. In the first part, the glucose is converted to gluconic acid and H2O2. This H2O2 which is formed is broken down by peroxidase. The function of peroxidase is to break down the H2O2 which is formed to water and active oxygen, that is nascent oxygen. Now this nascent oxygen which is formed is basically used to convert certain reduced chromogens which is there in the reagent to form a colored compound. These reduced chromogens may be something like phenoxyons or indophenols which are present in the reagent. Under reduced conditions they are colorless, but when they are oxidized they will give a colored solution. So more the amount of glucose in the solution in the blood, more amount of H2O2 will be formed in the first reaction by oxidase, and in the second reaction the H2O2 which is formed will be broken down by peroxidase to form more amount of nascent oxygen. As a result, the color obtained will be darker. So this is the function of glucose oxidase and peroxidase in blood glucose estimation. Next question, please.
Myself, Shrita Modi from SM Panchal Science College, Talud. My question is, how anticoagulants prevent blood coagulation?
Okay. As you know, anticoagulants name itself suggests that these are the compounds which are added in the blood to prevent the coagulation. Blood coagulation is a very complicated process and in which many enzymes, cofactors and various proteins play a role. There are two pathways, intrinsic and extrinsic pathway, which finally meets together to convert the fibrinogen to fibrin, and this fibrin will help in clotting the blood and trapping the thrombocytes. So this is in short the principle of blood clotting. Now anticoagulants which are being used, we classify or they fall into four categories. In the first one, the group in which they bind to calcium, free calcium is made unavailable. Now what is the importance of calcium? Calcium basically takes part in a second last reaction in which the prothrombin is converted to thrombin, and this thrombin will be converting fibrinogen to fibrin. So conversion of prothrombin to thrombin requires the presence of calcium ions. So if calcium ions are not made available to the system during the reaction, then the entire process will not take place. So coagulation will not take place. So the first group, that is binding of calcium and making it non-available, examples is calcium oxalate. Then the second one is it binds to the calcium and converts it into a non-ionized form. The example of such coagulants are sodium citrate and EDTA. EDTA is a chelating agent. They will be converting calcium into non-ionized form. The third one is enzyme poisoning. Example is fluorides. Fluorides acts as an anticoagulant because they poison the enzymes by binding with calcium. And finally, certain anticoagulants which are considered to be natural anticoagulants like heparin. Heparin will inactivate thrombin and thromboplastin. So, by this process, whatever the anticoagulant which you use, basically will be able to prevent the coagulation of blood. Next question, please.
I'm Anita Tadesagar from RG Shah Science College, and I would like to ask that what is window period?
Sir.
You must be knowing that whenever the human body is infected by a pathogen, it offers three different defense mechanisms. The first line of defense is called the skin and the mucous membrane. Then the next defense mechanism is that of phagocytosis. And if both of these do not succeed in preventing the infection, the third layer of defense is the antibody generation, the immune response of the body. So naturally, whenever we have to diagnose the disease, one of the most reliable methods for disease diagnosis is that of the detection of the respective antibody from the serum of the suspected individual. We expect that once the infection has successfully taken root into the human blood circulatory system, the immune response should also be detected, and a certain amount of the antibody should be detected from the blood serum. Now, in case of certain diseases, especially I believe in case of the HIV infection, what happens is that the antibody doesn't develop instantaneously the moment the infection takes place. The human body does not respond by generation of the antibodies. So there is what we call the lapse or the lag period between the successful infection and the development of sufficient amount of antibodies in the blood serum. And this lag period, the latent period we can also call it, is known as the window period, right? We may have the next question, please.
Myself Ikjyothi here. I am from Gujarat Arts and Science College, and my question is that why blood cells are called formed elements?
Thank you, Jyoti. In response to your question, blood cells are called formed elements. Why? If you see the composition of the blood, then you will find that blood has basically, we can classify into two categories. One is a liquid portion, and in which you will find certain dissolved substances as well as certain immunoglobulins and other proteins, digested nutrients, certain waste materials which are carried out, which are always in a dissolved form. The second one is the formed elements, that is the cellular constituents. These are the three types of formed elements: RBC, WBC and platelets, what we call them as thrombocytes, leukocytes and reticulocytes, that is red blood cells, erythrocytes. Now these elements are known as formed elements because they are formed in bone marrow, and their origin is a common ancestral cell. From there, from bone marrow, through a sequence of reactions, the cells get mature and finally it comes into a circulatory system. As a result of this, the cellular components of the blood are known as formed elements. Next, please. Next question.
Myself, Anu Patel. I am from SM Panchal Science College, Talod, and I want to ask that what is titer and what is its importance in serological reaction?
Well, only a little while ago we made reference to the immune response of the human body, and I expect the students of TYBSc to be well versed with the fact that human body always responds by developing specific variety of antibodies against a particular type of infection that is successfully taken in. Depending upon the kind of infection, the response of the human body is quite variable. In certain cases, the response is almost instantaneous. That is, the moment the infection takes in, the body develops the antibodies. And also there is a variation in the amount of antibody that is developed by the body. In certain cases, body immediately produces a good amount of antibody. In certain cases, naturally, or in most cases, because the person has already been previously vaccinated. So the infection works as the booster dose of the particular infection. Now, to be able to find out how much depth the infection is taken in, how much the disease has spread into the human body, and what kind of effect the disease resulting because of the infection will affect the human body, it becomes necessary to find out the amount of antibodies that are developed by the body and that are present in the bloodstream of the human body, the individual who is suffering with the disease. Unless we know the quantity of the antibody in the human who is suspected of suffering with a particular disease, the stage in which the disease exists cannot be determined. And therefore, we measure the amount of antibody by a program where we find out, we go on diluting the human serum containing the antibody, and every time we react it with an antigen available from the market, and we work out to the level where the reaction does not exist, the reaction ceases to exist, that is, it doesn't take place between the antigen and the particular dilution of the serum containing antibodies. So the highest dilution of the serum, which still gives a positive reaction, or putting it in other words, the highest dilution beyond which there is no reaction between the antigen and the antibody, should be considered a titer. It gives us an indirect measure of the amount of antibodies. For example, if there are 100,000 units of antibody which are required to give a reaction with a particular dose of antigen, and if the individual has 200,000 units of antibody per ml in his blood, what will happen that after a couple of dilutions, 1:2 or 1:4, you will not get reaction. So you know that the highest dilution which gives a positive reaction is only 1:2. So you'll have a rough idea, not precise, but a rough idea that the the concentration of antibody in particular human is about 200,000 units of antibody per ml. So you can say, indirectly suggest that the disease has not taken much root inside the body. But if you go on diluting and diluting and diluting and still get a positive reaction, then there is a time to dread that the disease has taken roots very deeply in the human body. So this is why the titer determination is very important. Titer, I hope you understood, it is the highest dilution of the antibody beyond which the reaction doesn't take place between the antigen. And this is the reason why we have to find out the titer. I hope that explains it. Thank you.
Okay, next question please.
Hello sir, myself Sumitra Kharadi, coming from Ajisa Science College, Ahmedabad. My question is that why ABO and RH blood groups are important for transfusion as compared to other blood groups?
Well, Sumitra, body has basically two important, or the blood of human beings are being classified into two important, or I would say major blood groups, that is ABO group as well as RH group. Apart from this, there exist various minor blood groups also. Say for example, P blood group, Duffy blood group, Lutheran blood group, YT blood group, VI blood group, and so on. Totally, it has been found that there exist more than 500 blood groups, but out of which only two are considered as a major and important one because they play an important role during blood transfusion. The reason being why minor groups are not being considered important, there are four basic reasons. First one, the antigenicity of these minor group is not so strong. That is, they have a weak antigenicity as well. As a result, the antibody formation does not take place. Second is, the corresponding, that is the opposite antibody does not exist in the human beings. The third reason is, if at all immune reaction is obtained, if at all the transfusion takes place, then these minor antibodies, they would only elicit the antibody formation only after multiple transfusion. That is, more than 3-4 transfusions are required so as to give rise to a corresponding antibody. And finally, in certain cases, the antibodies react only at a very low temperature. These are known as a cold antibodies, and hence they do not react at a temperature of a normal human body, that is 37 degrees. So combination of any one or more of these helps us not to bother about the minor blood groups, and therefore we concentrate mainly on the matching and the cross reactivity of ABO and RH blood group. Okay, so this was your answer, Sumitra. Next question.
Hello sir, my name is Sunil Makwana from Gujarat Arts and Science College. My question is, what is mass transfer rate? What is the purpose of OTR test, and why fixed amount of solution is taken in flasks?
Okay, Mr. Makwana, you must have studied that during the fermentation process at industrial level, in a fermenter, we add inoculum, and the fermenter already has a medium. Now basically the aim of a medium is to provide all necessary nutrients required for the growth, and these includes carbon sources, nitrogen sources, sources for other elements, as well as the oxygen. Now the transfer of all these nutrients into the cell is one part, and the second part is the cell metabolism. When it takes place, it also produces certain waste matter. So the transfer of these materials or the end product of a reaction from cell to the medium, that is, it throws out of the cell into the medium. So this two-way transfer, that is the transfer of nutrients into the cell and the transfer of waste material or the product outside the cell, this is known as a mass transfer. Now mass transfer is very important in the sense that whenever a fermentation process is to be carried out successfully, the transfer of any element which is transferred slowest means whose rate is the minimum, that is considered to be a very vital. And when we are discussing about the industrial fermentation, one of the factor is the mass transfer of oxygen, and that is why the mass transfer of oxygen, that is OTR, oxygen transfer rate, is considered to be very vital for a fermentation process, and that rate is to be determined. In laboratory, we determine this OTR rate by an experiment in which we take the definite amount of solution in a flask, and that is Na2SO3 solution, sodium sulfide solution, which in presence of oxygen will instantaneously be converted to Na2SO4, and which is then determined titrametrically by adding iodine and other things. Now basically the amount of solution which is taken in a flask is extremely limited in the sense that just 20 to 25% of the volume of the flask is taken. If you fill up the entire flask with the solution, or if you fill up it half with the solution, then the possibilities of oxygen getting into it is very less, because oxygen is there in the atmosphere. It has to penetrate through that atmosphere into the liquid, and the rate determination will be very poor, or the rate of transfer will be poor. And therefore when you take only 20 to 25% of the solution in a flask, for example, if you have a 500 ml flask, it is better, or it is advisable to take a solution of approximately 100 to 200 ml maximum, so that the oxygen which is there in the flask will be able to get dissolved into the solution. As a result, the OTR is determined. Okay, next question.
I'm Nilesh Chaudhary from Talod Science College. My question is, how the sterility testing medical device is done?
Okay, sterility testing of medical devices can be done in different ways. Basically, sterility testing of medical device is only essential when that device is to be inserted into the body, or through that device some fluid or other things are to be given to the individual who is sick. Now in that case, there are two methods of doing it. Either you pass sterile fluid through that device which is to be used, collect that fluid and do its sterility, or the second way is to swab the surface of that medical device which is to be placed in the body and do the sterility testing of that swab. If the device is small enough, of a size of a coin, that is around 1 to 2 inches, then that device as a whole can be put into a broth, either 100 ml flask or a 200 ml flask, and the growth can be observed. And this requires aerobic testing as well as anaerobic testing. So the medical devices can be checked for its sterility by either of these procedures. Next question.
My name is Avni Gondalia from Gujarat Arts and Science College. My question is, what is ropey or stringy fermentation?
Sir?
This is a question of common interest. However, I expect all of you must have studied this in your SYBSc classes, the ropey milk. This is a particular condition when the milk is infected with streptococci or Enterobacter aerogenes, or even sometimes certain lactobacilli are capable of doing this. What happens is that the carbohydrate content of the milk is so severely fermented that the constituents of the milk, the carbohydrates as well as the protein, are separated, and the milk protein especially is shredded, that is, it is disintegrated into individual fiber-like structure, which is called the shredding of the milk. This is also called the stormy fermentation, and because each individual shred of the milk protein can be seen as a fiber, we also call it the ropey milk. So this is what happens when the milk is unduly contaminated with undesirable organisms during the milking practices or by some other reasons. Does it explain the question? Okay, thank you.
Next question, please.
Myself, Shivani Dave from SM Panchal Science College, Talud, and my question is, what is the function of HgCl2 in heme solution and glacial acetic acid in Turk solution?
Okay, Shivani, let us take the composition of heme solution first. Heme solution is basically used for counting of blood cells, that is erythrocytes, RBCs. Now, in heme solution, heme solution I would say, heme solution is basically used for counting by dilution. Number of blood cells in blood are so high that if they are placed under microscope, that is in a Neuber chamber, that is a specialized counting chamber, it is not possible to count them with the naked eye even by using a microscope. And therefore what is necessary is to dilute the blood cells. Now this dilution of blood cells can be carried out by a kind of a pipette, Thomas pipette, which we generally use. Now in case of RBCs counting and WBC counting, things are bit different in both the ways, in the sense that number of RBCs are too high as compared to WBCs. And therefore, when we use glacial acetic acid, what happens is that this glacial acetic acid, which is there in Turk solution, will lyse RBCs. If it doesn't lyse the RBCs, then ratio of WBCs and RBCs is tremendously high. For every one WBC, there are more than 5,000 RBCs in a human being. And therefore, they will interfere with the counting of white blood cells. So, glacial acetic acid in TURG solution will lyse specifically and selectively RBCs. While in case of Hames solution, which contains Na2SO3 as well as HgCl2, the main role of Na2SO3 is to prevent the aggregation of the cells. Otherwise, they will form a stakes of the cells. They will attach one with one another. What the process we call it as a Rolex formation. And the function of HgCl2 is to act as a disinfectant. This is a kind of a prevention or a precautions which is taken so as not to get infected during the collection procedure as well as the investigation of the bloods. Okay. Next question, please.
Myself, Amit Shukla from RG Shah Science College. My question is how H and O antigen are prepared.
Okay. Preparation of H and O antigens. In laboratory, these antigens can be prepared by growing the cells and harvesting the cells from a medium. First, let me tell you, H antigens are basically flagellar antigens and O antigens are somatic antigens. Flagellar antigens are due to the presence of flagella, while somatic antigen is due to the surface cell wall. Now, these antigens can be prepared in a sense that flagella, that is the H antigens, can withstand the treatment with formalin while they are destroyed by the treatment with heat, phenol and alcohol. So this selective tolerance of flagellar antigen towards these chemicals can be used or can be taken up for preparing H antigen and O antigens. For preparing H antigens, what we do is we grow the cells, specifically those cells which are motile, because it is a flagellar antigens. So motile strain is grown, it is harvested, it is washed with saline, and finally they are suspended in a formalin solution. In few cases they are also heated up, so that not heated up to very high content but heated up to 50 degrees centigrade. Flagellar antigens are prepared like this, while the somatic antigens can be prepared by selecting a non-motile strain of the organisms and giving them a treatment of phenol, heat or alcohol. So that will destroy, if motile strain is selected, if then this treatment will destroy the flagellar antigen and will continue with the somatic antigens. But if it is a non-motile strain, then directly one can use it because there are no flagella on it. Okay. Next question, please.
Hello, sir. My question is, why E. coli gives some metallic stain on EMB agar plate?
EMB agar, eosine methylene blue agar plate, contains two different dyes, as the name itself suggests, eosine as well as methylene blue. Now these two dyes are incorporated in the constitution of the medium, and the medium also contains, apart from other sources of carbon, the sugar lactose. Now you all must be fully aware of the fact that E. coli is one of the most vigorous fermenters of sugar lactose. It can break down lactose into acid and gas, and the acid which is developed because of this fermentative reaction accumulates in the medium. Now as the medium gets accumulated with more and more of acid, it has the tendency of leaking out the dyes from the basic constitution of the medium, from the very well fabricated constitution of the medium. The two dyes start leaking out, and it is because of the leaking out of the dyes from within the medium onto the surface of the medium, you get a very typical metallic sheen, and we recognize it, we identify it as an indicator rather of having the growth of Escherichia coli on the surface of the medium. Apart from Escherichia coli, there are certain other organisms which can do this, but as far as the syllabus of undergraduate students is concerned, it is only E. coli which can do this, and therefore this presence of greenish metallic sheen on the surface of the eosine methylene agar plate is indicative of presence of Escherichia coli.
Okay, next question.
My question is, why the markings of WBC and RBC counting are different on thomapipette?
Okay, basically the markings, as I already replied earlier, that whenever we are counting WBCs and RBCs, the prime step is to dilute the blood cells. Dilution is necessary, otherwise it is not possible to count the cells under microscope by using a special counting chamber. So in order to dilute the cells and to do an accurate dilution, we have a thomapipette, in which in thomapipette there are two kinds of pipette. For RBCs and WBCs, both are different because different dilutions are required in both the cases. Since the number of WBCs is less, that is around 5 to 10 thousands per cubic mm cube, that is cubic millimeters in the blood, the dilution required is less, and therefore blood is withdrawn up to 5, marking 5, and it is diluted up to the mark 11. So the final dilution will be 1:20. While in case of RBC, it is higher dilution which is required because the number of RBCs in a blood of a normal individual is around 4.5 to 6.5 million cells per cubic millimeter, and therefore higher dilution is required. That is, the dilution is done 200 times by withdrawing the blood up to 5 and then diluting it with the diluting fluid, that is the heme solution, up to the mark 101. This gives 1:200 dilution. Now in some cases, if you do not have the pipettes, these dilutions can also be carried out in a test tubes. That is, you dilute it 1:20 or 1:200 times by using an ordinary pipette, and then that diluted blood can be used for counting. So the purpose of Thomas pipette is simply for a dilution of the blood cells. Okay, next question.
My question is, what is the mechanism of UV mutation?
I hope what you mean is UV induced mutations, right? Ultraviolet radiations are basically not mutagens. Let me make it very clear. They are not basically mutagens. They are the lethal radiations. Like many more varieties of the radiations, ultraviolet radiations are working as the bacterio-lethal agencies as well. You must be knowing the mechanism by means of which ultraviolet radiations kill the bacterial cells. They induce the development of 5-6 cyclohexane bonds among the adjacent pyrimidine nucleotides, especially the thymine nucleotides, but bonds can also develop between two cytosine nucleotides or a cytosine and a thymidine nucleotide. What is important is that these bonds, once the bonds are developed, the respective nucleotides, the pair of nucleotides between which these bonds have developed are called the dimer, and these dimers interact with both the process of transcription of the DNA as well as that of the replication of the DNA. Neither of the process will be allowed to progress normally, and therefore it becomes imperative for the bacterial cells to get rid of these dimers. Now there are different mechanisms by means of which these dimers can be removed. There are indirect methods and there are direct methods as well. The direct method, that of photoreactivation, which is most popularly known to almost every student of TY-BSc, goes to the site where the dimer has developed and removes the bonds, and thus it just restores the original DNA structure. However, in case of the indirect methods, for example the excision repair, what happens is that the dimer containing part of that particular strand is removed, and in the place of the removed nucleotides, a fresh strand will have to be synthesized. Now it is during this process of resynthesis where the probability that a wrong nucleotide will be incorporated arises. And this is how the development of a mutation can probably take place. So UV itself, let us be very clear, is not a mutagen as it is popularly known to almost all of us. UV is a lethal agency, but because of the restoration of the tendency of the bacterial cells to restore the original structure during the indirect repair mechanisms, probability of the mutation arises. Right? This is how the UV acts indirectly as a mutagen.
Okay, next question please.
My question is, explain how plaques are formed and what are the different types of plaques?
Okay, plaques are basically formed on a medium where there is a lone growth of bacteria, and plaques are nothing else but in that lone growth we have a clear zone where the lysis of bacteria have taken place. Now during the plaque formation, what happens is you have studied the multiplication of bacteria. The final stage is the lysis of the cells, attachment, penetration, assembly and lysis of the cells. And therefore, when the cell will lyse, it will release number of plaques, number of viruses. These viruses in turn attack the adjoining or neighboring cells, intact cells, and will carry out the lytic cycle in them too. This chain continuously goes on, and as a result what we have that in a definitive area, in a particular area, all bacterial cells have lysed, they have been destroyed. This leads to the formation of a clear zone among the lone growth of the organisms which is there on the plate. Plaques are only observed if the lone growth is observed, that is when the number of bacterial cells inoculum is very high as compared to the viruses. Otherwise the viruses will eat away entire cells. If the number of viruses are large, then you will not be able to observe anything on the plate. So this is what the plaque is formed. Now how many types of plaques are there? There are many types, but for you it is important to know that we have one variety, what we call it is a clear plaque, and the other one is a turbid plaque. Turbid plaques are basically formed due to the formation of a turbid plaques are formed because of the formation of the attack by the lysogenic phages. So these are the two main types of plaques which are formed. Next question please.
My question is, what is the significance of crowded plate technique and which one is better, crowded plate technique or Wilkins method?
Both the techniques are used for screening of antibiotic producing organisms from the source, usually soil. Now crowded plate technique is aimed to find a antibiotic producing organism which is present in the soil, which is not directed against any particular strain. Antibiotic not directed against any of these strains. While in case of a Wilkins method, we are using a pH indicator dye, and therefore what we do is it will help us not only to detect the antibiotic activity, that is a zone which is formed is due to the antibiotic, or it is because of acid, and second thing, we are using a target organism, that is the strain against which the antibiotic is to be screened. So that is the advantage of Wilkins method. While in case of a crowded plate technique, it is against the general non-specific method. It is against any particular strain, not particularly directed against any organism. It is in general whether we want to, when we go on to for an antibiotic, we have to. So in the secondary staining, more work is to be done over the isolated strains. Next question.
My question is, what is the objective of bioassay?
Bioassay is basically nothing else but the quantitative estimation of any substance. Now this bioassay can be done by variety of basically we classify into growth promoting bioassays and growth inhibiting substances, bioassays of growth inhibiting substance. Assay of a compound can be done chemically also, but it is also done by biological systems, by using microorganisms specifically. There are lots of advantages. It is more specific, it is economical, it is quick, and more important is it is very sensitive. It can detect up to micrograms levels of a compound. So this is what we have about bioassay. Now, due to the time constraint, we will be able to take only one question more. So please, the last question.
Sir,
Now-
I want to ask that why 1:2 dilution is carried out in unknown solution in Follin's and Nelson's method.
Yes.
It is not necessary. It's not necessarily to be diluting the given sample to 1:2 factor. Basically, you must be knowing that we prepare a standard chart, the graph depicted on the graph paper, depending upon the different standard values. You get a standard from which you take different aliquots, different concentration of the given material, and effectively you check the optical density, which is now called the absorbance. We don't recognize it optical density anymore, we call it absorbance. Anyway, the absorbance has to be noted down, and you get a typical 45-degree straight line graph. Now you don't know the unknown sample, that is basically the reason why you have to carry out the entire process. You don't know how much concentration of the given sample would be present in the sample. So you take randomly two readings from the undiluted sample. One is 0.5 ml of the sample and one is 1 ml of aliquot. Now next step is the dilution of the sample. You anticipate that the dilution factor 1:2 will reduce the amount of the particular, for example, in case of Nelson, the sugar glucose, or in case of Follin method, protein sample. You anticipate that the sugar sample or the protein sample will be effectively diluted to a level where its absorbance value will fall within the range of the graph which has already been developed on the basis of the standard readings. So once again you dilute it, and then once again you take two readings, 0.5 ml reading and 1 ml reading. It is likely, it can happen that both these readings will still not fall within the range. They will be higher than the range of the graph which you have already drawn, you have already developed. In that case, what has to be done? There are two options. Either you take a aliquot from the same dilution of the lesser value. For example, you have prepared 1:2 dilution and you took 0.5 ml and 1 ml aliquots. Now you take 0.1 ml and 0.2 aliquots, 0.2 ml aliquots. So, and anticipate that the readings will fall within the range of the graph, or you can dilute the sample further. Instead of 1:2, you can dilute it to 1:4 or maybe 1:5 or 1:10, and then take effectively the aliquots of suitable amount. What is important is that in TYBSc you are just being primed into the experimental procedures. As you will grow ahead, as you will enter your postgraduate programs and even further research programs, you will learn to develop all these by trial and error. If the result doesn't fall within the range by this, you dilute it further, or maybe depending upon the kind of results that you get. So at the moment in TYBSc you are encouraged to dilute the sample to 1:2 dilution factor, because we want that you should be primed into the experimental programs, right? So that is why. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I thank Professor Piyush Pandya, who has helped me in solving certain queries from the students. And because of time constraint, no doubt the difficulties are too many, but because of the time constraint, we have been able to take around 25-30 questions. And next time, whenever we get certain chances, we will take up such kind of program and will help to overcome your difficulties. At the end, I would like to thank the BISEC studio as well as the crew of this BISEC for taking us alive and reaching it to so many students. I would also like to thank the Department of Education, Commissioner Higher Education, who has organized these kinds of series of lectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Namaste.